They came like an ocean rolling over the plain, an organized, armored tide whose shadow swallowed villages before the banners even reached them. 40,000 men or thereabouts, bronze cannons the size of small houses, engineers and sappers with shovels and ropes, oxen and camels groaning under the weight of artillery. Against that machine stood a single hilltop fortress, garrisoned by roughly 2,000 defenders and a scattering of civilians. It was a handful of stone and people facing what looked, to every observer, like inevitability. This was a frontier that had been bleeding for years. Towns had burned, fields had been abandoned. The road north to the mining towns, rich pockets of ore that fed economies and armies alike, lay exposed each time another bulwark collapsed. Every fortress that fell made the next one more precarious. Every retreat hardened the sense that the frontier was shrinking by the month. In that context, the hilltop fortress mattered more than its walls suggested. If it fell, the approach to those mines would be far less defensible, and a crucial line of local supply and shelter would vanish. That made this place a last visible stand, a focal point where numbers alone could not account for what was riding on its survival: lives, livelihoods, and the stubborn belief that one community could still resist. They named their commander. Records render the name variously: Isvo, Dao, Do, but whatever the spelling, his method was the same. He walked the parapets with a practiced eye, measuring angles, noting the weakest joints where mortar had crumbled, listening to the groan of beams. He had learned, the hard way, that panic ate fortifications faster than any cannon. His first order was not to raise more banners or stockpile more powder. It was to turn everyone into a useful instrument of defense. Masons who had once refined doorways were now filling breaches. Blacksmiths abandoned household tools and turned to shoring beams and reinforcing arrow slits. Women drew water into tubs and took up hammers. Youths hauled stones, ferried coal, and tended to wounded soldiers. The rhythm of survival became communal labor. Outside, the Ottoman host settled into siege routine with horrifying efficiency. Its approach had been more engineering than cavalry charge. Siege artillery emplaced on prepared platforms, log-lined roads for heavy guns, tents that multiplied into a temporary city. Siege warfare in this age was less about glory and more a calculus of pressure: shell away at a wall until it surrendered its geometry. Engineers supervised the construction of scarps and trenches. The sappers dug zigzag approaches to protect advancing men from enfilade fire, and camps buzzed with the low industry of supply and repair. The besiegers had numbers, discipline, and time. They intended to use all three until stone became dust and breath became smoke.
The disparity in force was the story's headline: 2,000 against 40,000. But numbers are scales, not fate. The defenders could not match the Ottoman for weight of shot or length of supply chain. What they could do, and what they did, was buy moments and turn them into opportunities. Strategy in their hands was the careful management of scarcity. Within the fortress, Isvo turned scarcity into a system. He rationed powder in strict ledgers, rotated men to keep them from exhaustion, and ordered parapet traverses, quick improvised walls built behind the main parapet to give defenders second lines of fire if the outer wall failed. He parceled out tasks with the quiet authority of a man who had learned that terror was contagious and that orders were a way to inoculate a community against it. When cannons fell silent at night, he had teams plastering mortar into hairline cracks, boys sweeping rubble into wheelbarrows, women tying leather to ladders so they might hold together even as rope frayed. The fortress became a workshop for improvisation. Amid this network of repair and resolve, there was another figure, young, restless, and given to modifying things that were supposed to be immutable. Sources render his name with variations: Garalai Boramisa, Bornamesa, but the man in the workshop was clear enough. He worked by lamplight in a room near the armory, surrounded by pots, clay molds, ropes, and jars of pitch and oil. He did not invent fire. He refined how it could be delivered. His creations were crude by any modern engineering standard: clay spheres that contained intermittent charges, jars of pitch sealed inside wicker cages, rolling pots that could be sent tumbling down the glacis. But each one had a single tactical purpose: to disrupt. He was not the kind of inventor who built miracles out of science. He built practical devices that made formations falter, ladders burn, and discipline break for a moment. In siegecraft, a moment could be the difference between survival and collapse. His workshop was at once a laboratory of necessity and a school of psychology. He understood that an army is not merely metal and flesh, but a set of expectations. A line of infantry expects to see orderly volleys and coordinated ladders. When their expectations are interrupted, when smoke wraps like a living thing around their faces, when a spiral of fire consumes a ladder, discipline frays. Geralaya's devices exploited that human element. They did not promise annihilation of the enemy. They promised disruption, confusion, and the time needed for defenders to mend a wall or close a breach. The first use of these devices on the field was modest in spectacle, but enormous in consequence. A small squad of Ottoman infantry was advancing under the protection of a siege tower. Geralaya's crew rolled a set of stitched pots toward the tower's base.
When one struck a timber and shivered, a spray of burning pitch fed a sudden live flame that licked the wooden planking. The tower's rate of advance slowed as men hauled burning ropes and tried to stamp out the flare. That pause cascaded. Archers in the fortress concentrated fire. Sappers nearby were caught in a shower of flaming shrapnel. A clean, trained advance became a scattered series of reactions. The defenders, seeing how a single improvised device could unsettle a carefully drilled advance, began to rely on such asymmetric means as practical multipliers. Siege warfare is, above all, a test of attrition. Each morning began in the same grim rhythm. Dawn cannonade, followed by grinding repairs, a day's worth of sand, stone, and sweat, occasional sallies by small groups to harass engineers, and at dusk, counting of the living. The attackers increased pressure in stages, first probing shots to test the wall's weaknesses, then sustained bombardment concentrated on a given point, then the digging of trenches and approaches that would enable men and ladders to come within striking distance. For the defenders, endurance was the primary resource. Fatigue made decisions slower, nails loosened, mortar powdered, and ropes frayed. As days bled into one another, the southern wall became the focus of attrition. It was older, its stones settled on a softer foundation, and the Ottoman gunners chose it because of range, line of sight, and a cruel arithmetic. Hit the same weak spot enough times and physics would do the rest. The defenders shorted with timber supports, and behind those supports built the traverse walls, but timber can only hold so much, and the constant concussion of shot loosened bedrock and sent dust into hair and mouths. Men who had once laughed together now spoke in short sentences. The young inventor's devices continued to be useful, but could not replace crumbling masonry. Then, on the 9th day of concentrated assault, the wall gave way. What happened in the moments after the collapse can be described like a simple sequence of physical events, and also like a tightly wound human drama. Stone fell, dust rose in a cloud like a harp of gray. For 2 hours the sound was constant, the percussion of cannon, the slap of stones against earth, men shouting orders and names. Through the gap flooded a column of Ottoman infantry, shields raised, ladders set against breached lengths of wall. It is easy to imagine an inevitable sweep, trained men moving into the tight space of a breach, consolidating and pouring into the fortress to take it by force. That was the designed plan, yet plans assume cohesion. Cohesion is what failed. Inside the breach the fighting was narrow and savage in the sense of closeness, not gratuitous gore. Men grappled across jagged stones and upturned beams. There was smoke, not only from powder but from the inventor's pots, and from the occasional flare when pitch met flame in a confined space.
The defenders, forced out of formation, fought with short swords, stout pikes, and any tool that made a grip. Isfo moved like a conductor among them. Short, directive gestures, a command bark here, a reposition there. He used small groups like wedges, pressing at the edges of the breach to create pockets of resistance. If the Ottomans had expected a rout once the breach existed, they found a resistance that had the solidity of iron in the right places and the elasticity of rope elsewhere. It was at this most precarious point that contingency intervened. The besiegers had been generating smoke as part of their effort. The smell of powder and burning cordage was already thick, but weather does not listen to battle plans. A wind that had been pushing out from the fortress changed direction subtly and then decisively, swinging from a breeze that had been carrying smoke away to a gust that drove smoke and cinders back into the attackers' lines. For the Ottoman infantry massed in front of the breach, visibility dropped in an instant. The noise of command was muffled by choking air. What had been a single coherent push became staggered bursts of movement as men coughed and tried to shield their eyes. This is the moment that contemporaries and later storytellers would call miraculous, the storm of smoke that blinded the attackers when the defenders needed a reprieve. But the word miracle obscures vital causal threats. It was not a supernatural hand, but a particular alignment of human action and natural contingency.
The defenders had, crucially, prepared for smoke. They had placed wet hides that could be used as screens. They had stockpiled pitch to feed flame where it could be useful, and they had trained men to use close-in, high-intensity weapons in the event of a breach. In other words, they had engineered responses that mattered only when the wind obliged them. The wind's change did not win the day by itself. It created a short window of confusion that disciplined, practiced resistance could exploit. When the smoke rolled back over the attackers, it did several things at once. It reduced visibility so sharply that units lost sight of their neighboring contingents. It fouled muskets and matchlocks, making coordinated volleys unreliable. Moreover, the Ottoman command structure, methodical under ideal conditions, relied on communication that was difficult across a wall of choking air. Orders were delayed, reinforcements mislocated. Discipline, which relies on clear signals, faltered. The defenders seized that fragile advantage. A detachment under Isfo's immediate command surged through a side postern and aimed straight for the breach's flank, where stones and timber still made a precarious ladder for returning control. Other bands rolled Garrelets pots into the approach trenches, not to cause massive casualties, but to sow further disorder. Flame and smoke where organized ranks had tried to stand.
Men who had been pinned to the parapet now surged forward with a near-violent calm. There was panic, but also an extremely focused energy that comes from people who have prepared for the exact moment of needing to act. Once momentum favored the defenders, it accelerated. The attackers who had made it through the breach found themselves hemmed in by rubble, exposed on multiple sides to short-range attacks. Where they had expected depth, the ability to pour more men across the gap, they found blockage. Reinforcements now had to cross open ground clogged with embers and flailing bodies, all under the uncertain smokescreen. The Ottomans, experts at siege logic, attempted to reform lines, to bring fresh troops forward, but cohesion was the invisible commodity that had been lost. Commanders tried to issue new orders. Couriers could not thread the smoke. The wheels of coordinated movement slowed into uncoordinated pushes. In that hour, the psychological weight of the siege shifted. For the besiegers, what had been a technical operation became a gamble in which time no longer favored them as cleanly. For the defenders, this was the narrow chance every community in a long siege waits for, a chance to transform defense into counterattack. They took it. What followed was not a dramatic sally that routed the whole army. It was, rather, a careful and courageous tightening of space around the breach, supplemented by well-timed use of fire and smoke devices to prevent reformation of enemy columns. Small groups harried and attacked exposed artillery crews, set light to powder wagons where possible, and cut ropes and rigging on siege engines. Engineers who had been tending the guns were suddenly harassed enough to be ineffective. Morale among the besiegers plummeted into a chorus of fatigue and disarray. The decision to withdraw was not made in one grand council. It came as a series of local choices that aggregated into retreat. Commanders, noting that the assembled effort to take the fortress by the chosen timetable had failed and that losses were rising, ordered poles back to more defensible lines. Tents that had been a day earlier full of men became empty. Wagons were cut from their moorings and dragged to new positions. Cannons were spiked and hauled away when necessary. What prevailed over the plain in the hours and days that followed was a practical calculus. The cost of continuing the siege under the new, unpredictable conditions outweighed the immediate gain. History often labels the moment a small force victory as one that humiliated the larger power. The term fits because humiliation, in this context, is psychological and reputational. An army that prides itself on the ability to reduce a fortress, especially an army of such size, was publicly denied a clean, decisive victory. Word spread among camps in nearby towns that a fortress held against overwhelming odds, and that does wound an image of invincibility. Yet it is important to keep the humility of perspective. The siege's outcome did not change the empire's strategic trajectory. It did not stop future campaigns. It did not, in any literal sense, reverse the forces that had produced frontier retreat. Its significance was local and symbolic. A community had resisted through ingenuity and discipline, and for a time a powerful force had been repelled. The aftermath inside the fortress was sober. Walls were scarred, corners of homes were charred black, families picked through rubble for keepsakes. The toll on bodies was real, but not the kind of carnage that gripes history by the throat and demands myth. Instead, the survivors spoke of stubbornness and of the small, repeated acts that had added up. The mason who labored through blistered hands to repoint a crumbling seam, the blacksmith who stayed to temper a new brace when an oak beam split, the woman who, after carrying water for hours, returned to bind wounds and hand out bread, the young inventor who, instead of being reviled for the danger his devices posed, was thanked for buying the fortress seconds and minutes that had saved lives. Their stories were quiet rather than bombastic. There was little singing, there was much work. Symbolically, the siege echoed in surrounding settlements. It became a story told at hearths, how a small garrison, a resolute commander, and a tinkering inventor combined with a change in weather to deny a huge army what it had planned. It became a cautionary tale to other besiegers and a source of modest pride to those who resisted. Yet the greater geopolitical flow remained unchanged. The frontier continued to ebb and shift with campaigns and negotiations elsewhere. The fortress's resilience did not arrest the larger momentum of the era. It did, however, provide a tangible counterexample to fatalism, a proof that defeat was not inevitable everywhere. What does this event teach about warfare and human agency? First, that ingenuity matters. Guerrilla Boromes's devices did not win the siege single-handedly. They were tools designed to maximize panic and disarray when properly applied. In the particular logic of siegecraft, where concentration of force is supposed to erode steadfastness, an asymmetric tactic that produces hesitation is enormously valuable. Second, leadership under pressure is decisive not because of grandeur, but because of the mundane tasks leaders insist on: discipline, rotation, rationing, and the assignment of clear responsibilities. Isvo's most important act was not a rousing speech, but the steady imposition of roles that turned civilians into useful defenders. Third, contingency, in this case a shift in wind, plays a real consequential role in history. To call it a miracle is to blur the human decisions that made the outcome exploitable. To call it merely luck is to diminish the preparation that made the lucky moment decisive.
There is also a human lesson that sits outside the technicalities of cannons and trenches. Solidarity matters. Siege survival is as much a social achievement as a military one. The fortress's people were not spectators to their own defense. They were participants. The mason's mortar, grounds, an inventive young man, and a disciplined commander does not mean the struggle was reducible to two people. It was a communal feat, a composite of small deeds under extreme pressure. For the Ottomans, the episode was instructive in a different register. It emphasized that siege operations, as efficient as they might be in the abstract, can be undone by practicalities. The difficulty of sustaining momentum under fire, the challenge of command in smoke, and the human cost of protracted operations far from secure supply lines. Larger armies have advantages, but they also have rigidities that smaller, more flexible defenders can exploit. Reputation, in war as in peace, is a fragile artifact. A single failure, especially one documented under dramatic counts of numbers, can resonate beyond its immediate harm. In the valley below the hill, once the fighting stopped, the wind carried away more than smoke. It carried stories, stories that would be retold in local inns, stitched into family histories, and occasionally amplified by chroniclers who liked the neatness of a David versus Goliath narrative. These storytellers would call the event the miracle and the humiliation, because those words simplify memory and give it sharp edges. Yet the most honest telling keeps the complexity, a fortitude of people, a commander who organized tasks instead of promises, an inventor who turned materials into tactical friction, and a weather shift that turned confusion into a decisive pause. In the quiet weeks that followed, reconstruction began. The damaged parapets were rebuilt not to their former glory, but to resistant pragmatism. Traverses to absorb future impact, cleared fields of fire to deny cover to approaching engineers, and stores reorganized to reduce the risk of accidental infernos. Where possible, the defenders took lessons from the siege. Place fresher supplies of damp hides near likely approaches, build workshops for quick repair, teach more of the populace the simple mechanics of fortification. These were not grand reforms, they were incremental, practical improvements born of necessity. The victory's humility was instructive for both sides. For the fortress, the knowledge that survival was possible, not inevitable and not permanent, was a renewer of courage. For the wider region, the episode was a reminder that the slope of history was not always smooth. Small acts could still complicate larger currents.
And for historians, the siege is a useful case study in how technology, leadership, collective labor, and chance interact in violent situations. It is a reminder that even overwhelming force has limits when confronted with adaptability and resolve. To close the loop on the title's promise, the phrase 2,000 versus 40,000 captures the drama of disproportion. The defenders were outnumbered by an order of magnitude and faced a siege force that had all the tools of late medieval warfare at its disposal.
The term miracle in local telling marked the event as extraordinary, and the word humiliated reflected an immediate blow to the besiegers' pride. But a careful account reveals a confluence of factors rather than a single miraculous intervention. Human ingenuity shaped the response, disciplined leadership applied pressure where needed, wives, boys, masons, and smiths kept the logistic heart of resistance beating, and a wind, indifferent to commanders, provided the gap that allowed those preparations to flower into effective action. This is not a story about destiny overturned or empires shaken at their foundations. It is instead a sober tale of how a small community organized itself against overwhelming pressure, and for reasons both planned and accidental, prevailed. It is a portrait of how warfare often hinges on ordinary courage, improvisation, and sheer obstinacy, qualities that are less glamorous in retelling, but no less compelling in reality. If this kind of deep dive into the contingencies of history interests you, subscribe for more stories where invention, leadership, and chance decide the odds. After the siege, people on both sides returned to their tasks. Some soldiers marched off to other campaigns. Some craftsmen stayed, repairing and improving. The Ottoman army regrouped, its commanders taking what lessons they could about siege timing and the management of smoke and fire. The fortress itself remained a scarred but living place, a locus of stories and a practical object of defensive learning. In the end, the most durable lesson was simple and human. In the face of overwhelming force, ordinary decisions can ripple outward until they carry a whole outcome with them. When a commander assigns roles with quiet authority, when an inventor looks at ordinary things and asks how they might be repurposed, when a community bends together rather than breaking apart, the calculus of war changes. A moment of weather can tilt a battle. A moment of preparation can make that weather decisive. The miracle of the hilltop fortress was not a suspension of natural law, but the extraordinary alignment of readiness, invention, leadership, and fortune. That alignment humiliated neither a people nor an empire eternally.
But for a handful of days, it reversed expectations, made a powerful army concede what it could not otherwise force, and left behind a story that would be told as long as people needed reminders that asymmetry in warfare was not always a sentence to be carried without resistance. The hilltop remained an emblem, not of triumphal conquest, but of stubborn determination and the thin, often fragile line between collapse and survival. If you found this reconstruction compelling, like and share this episode, and check out our playlist on sieges and asymmetric warfare to see how other small forces have shifted the course of single battles through ingenuity and will.